From 1939 onwards, the British government began to prepare for expected enemy bombing raids. In the 1930s, the public had been issued with gas masks. Gas had been used during the First World War, and the government were fearful of its effects if used on civilians. Training in schools warned children of the deadly effects of gas attacks.
This hand rattle means gas. Put on your gas mask and keep it on.
The government also supplied its citizens with two different types of air raid shelters. The first, Anderson shelters, were made of corrugated iron. They were designed to be sunk into the ground in people's gardens and had enough room for a family to stay in. They were far safer than staying in a house during a bombing raid. Altogether, over 400,000 Anderson shelters were distributed to families across Britain.
If you are hit with a steel shelter and have not erected it, do so at once. First, dig a pit 4 feet deep. Then, build your shelter inside it.
Later, in 1941, the government supplied Morrison shelters to civilians. This shelter could be erected indoors. By the end of the year, over 500,000 of these shelters had been distributed. When the air raids first began, people in London were not allowed to use the underground railway stations for fear that they would get trapped. However, public pressure soon forced the authorities to give way, and they became popular places to shelter. The blackout had the most immediate effect on the British people. In order that German bombers would not see cities from the air, and therefore target their bombing more precisely, people had to ensure that no light was visible from their homes. Failure to do so meant a visit from the air raid warden. Street lights were not lit and cars had to drive without lights. This in turn led to many accidents. In December 1939 alone, over 1,500 people were killed on British roads. Another precaution taken by the government was the mass evacuation of children from British towns and cities to the countryside. Many parents were reluctant to be separated from their children, but they did accept that they would be safer. Many city schools were closed, and many teachers went with the children to the countryside so they could continue teaching them. Evacuation did have some notable successes. Many children were fed better diets than they had done in the cities. Children were kept away from the worst dangers of the Blitz, and evacuation arguably saved many lives. Furthermore, evacuation enabled mothers still living in the cities to take on vital war work, such as building tanks, planes and munitions. In the long term, evacuation encouraged further social reform, as it highlighted the poor conditions many inner-city children lived in. However, the government policy of evacuation has also been criticised for many reasons. The administration of evacuees was often chaotic, with a lack of willing foster homes. Some children were resented by their foster families and missed their real families living in the city. This led to a number of children returning home during late 1939 and early 1940. When the intense German bombing of British cities began in late 1940, many children had to be evacuated again.